This morning comes from Matthew's Gospel, the 22nd chapter. We'll read verses 15 to 22. As you might imagine, this is coming toward the end of Matthew's Gospel, and tension is rising. Tension is rising between Jesus and the authorities, and this is the story of that tension. Again, Matthew 22, 15 to 22. Let's listen again for the word of the Lord. Well, then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" Well, Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test? You hypocrites! Show me the coin used to pay the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Well, whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "Well, the emperor's." And then he said to them, "Well, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." But when they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Christ. Please pray. Holy and gracious God, I pray the prayer of the psalmist, the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts will be pleasing and acceptable to you. And in Christ's name we pray. Amen. The writer P.J. O'Rourke once famously said that giving money and power to governments is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenagers. And that may be true. At least we think that it's true. And after all, we as Christians, quite frankly, have a long history of being skeptical of governments. It started out actually even before we were Christians, back when it was just our Jewish forebearers. You may know that story back in the book of 1 Samuel, where the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, come to the prophet and priest Samuel, begging him to anoint for them a king. Samuel warns them, of course. He says, "I know you want a king, like all your neighbors have a king, but make no mistake what this is going to mean. That king is going to tax you to death. That king is going to cart off all your best and brightest children off to ill-conceived and half-baked wars. That's what it means to have a king." And still they insist. And so he relents and he anoints for them King Saul. After King Saul, there comes King David. After King David, there is King Solomon. And after Solomon, there is a whole series of kings. Some of them pretty good, most of them pretty poor. After many years, then, things are not going so well in Israel. There is division. The government is falling apart. So it did not take long for some of their enemies, first the Assyrians, to take advantage of this situation and to invade them. And that, of course, as we know, for Israel, began just a long succession of conqueror after conqueror. After the Assyrians, there were the Babylonians. After the Babylonians, there were the Persians. After the Persians, the Greeks. After the Greeks, the Romans. Wave after wave of invading army. Wave after wave of oppressive government. And of course, the main problem with all these successive conquering governments was that they weren't their government. Granted, sometimes their governments had been pretty sketchy, but at least they had been their own. These bigger powers, they didn't care what happened to little people. Just keep those folks in their place, squeeze what you can out of them, use force if you have to. Shoot, just use force for the fun of it. Some of them did. It's no wonder then that the Jews resented every last one of those governments. By the time Jesus, of course, arrives on the scene, it's the Romans who are in control. And the Jews resented them most of all. They resented the Roman soldiers in their streets. They resented King Herod, who was just a puppet that the Roman government had put into place and claimed him to be king of the Jews, pass off as their official ruler. Why, some people said he wasn't even really Jewish. The Jews resented the oppressive taxes they were forced to pay at sword point. They resented the Roman coins in their marketplaces. And more than anything about those coins, they hated the fact that they bore the image of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, stamped right there on the side. And those words, those awful words that circled his head, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, and our high priest, the Roman coins read. Why, that was blasphemy. That was idolatry right from the Jewish book itself. An idol, a graven image. Augustus as God and Tiberius as the Son of God. Son of God, my foot. How dare they say that? That's why that little question that the Pharisees and the members of King Herod's political party made such a great trap for Jesus that day. It actually should be a clue, first of all, to us that something was up, that the Pharisees and the Herodians would have gotten together in the first place. After all, as far as the Pharisees were concerned, the Herodians were infidels. They were Roman sellouts. But Jesus was getting under the Pharisees' skin, and they wanted to get rid of him. Nothing unites you like a common enemy. And for the Pharisees and for the Herodians, that common enemy was Jesus. And so they ganged up together and they asked a trick question of Jesus. After flattering him, of course, they wryly asked him, "So tell us, Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes to the Roman emperor or not?" This is no innocent question. For they knew that if Jesus said yes, the religious authorities would have him immediately for heresy. Jesus was a sellout indeed, they would say. And that would be nothing compared to what the Jewish crowd, so mad at their Roman oppressors, were going to do to Jesus. But if he replied no, well, then that was treason to the Romans. The Roman soldiers would have hauled him off right on the spot and nailed him up. Of course, they did do that eventually. At this moment, though, Jesus outwits all of them. He asks them to pull out a Roman coin. Notice, of course, first of all, that Jesus' pockets are empty, but not theirs. Their pockets evidently are full of this idolatrous image of Caesar. These good religious folks, what these good religious folks were doing with a Roman coin in their pockets isn't mentioned, and Jesus doesn't bother them about it. Instead, Jesus simply asks them, "Well, tell me whose picture's on the side." "The Roman emperor's, of course," they reply. "Then give it back to him," he says, "and give to God what is God, what is God's." Well, that's a great comeback, don't you think? I mean, I'm always that sort of person that thinks of a comeback after the opportunity has passed. Ah, dang it, I should have said this. But not Jesus. He's a lot sharper than I am. He comes with a great comeback. And many have assumed then that he has a rather simple explanation. He sort of divides things up. Some things belong to Caesar, some things belong to God, and never the twain shall meet. That's the way our lives are, right? I mean, some things are left to government, our taxes, our schools, our civic responsibilities, and the things that belong to God are church on Sunday and maybe something in the offering plate. And notice, of course, when we divide things up like that, the important things end up belonging to the government, and God gets sort of the leftovers, but we'll get to that right now. Because if you notice, actually, the formula is not so clean-cut. It's not so easily divided. In fact, in the end, if you think about it, you realize that Jesus never actually answers the question. What exactly belongs to God? We might wonder. All of Jesus' audience knew the answer to that question. They had been taught it in Sabbath school since they were knee-high to a grasshopper. They knew the words, had been taught to memorize it. The first verse of the 24th Psalm. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. Wait a minute, are you saying that everything belongs to God? And how about this Roman coin that Jesus pulled out? If the Roman coin has Tiberius's face on it, and it belongs to Tiberius, then what has God's face stamped on it? Well, again, those Sabbath school students knew the answer to that question, too. It's right there in the first chapter of Genesis. And God made human beings in God's own image. Male and female, God created them. The coin has Tiberius's face on it, Jesus says. If you want to give him his chump change, go right ahead. But guess who has God's face imprinted on them? Well, hold on, though, quite a minute. If everything we have actually does belong to God, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and if we have God's face stamped on us, then what about the government on the other side? What actually belongs to Caesar? And quite frankly, I'm here to tell you, you know as well as I do, if you and I don't give to the government what belongs to the government, they're going to come along and cart us off. What are we supposed to do, Jesus? Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't utter a word to let us out of this tricky and sticky dilemma. So the question ultimately goes a bit unanswered, and the answers that we come up with are actually a bit unclear. The Christians went on with this uneasy relationship with the government for centuries. From the early years of the church, of course, the Romans were still in charge, and we know that the Romans liked Christians even less than they liked the Jews. In fact, did you know that it was a complaint among the early Roman Empire that, first of all, Christians must be unpatriotic because they weren't bowing towards Caesar. And to make matters worse, probably atheists too, because they don't recognize Caesar as God. And besides, anyway, it's a lot of fun watching them being torn apart by lions. That became the sport of emperors and common folk alike. It's not surprising then when you read the Apostle Paul writing in his letters, giving the advice to those early Christians to keep a low profile. Do as the government tells you, don't cause a stir. In fact, if you're paying attention, even in the midst of an oppressive government that Paul dealt with, you still may find God's grace and God's presence. But even the New Testament isn't clear on the subject. If you flip forwards to the end of the book and you read in the book of Revelation about John and what he wrote, John, the writer of Revelation, said that the government looks like a big, scary, horned beast to him. So which is it? What do we do? How do we resolve this dilemma? You would think that with so many Christians winding up behind bars and in front of lions' teeth, that the Bible would be a whole lot clearer that the government equals bad. But it doesn't. It seems even then, under the worst of situations, the government gets to be a mixed bag. Sometimes able to hurt, sometimes able to heal, sometimes able to do great good, and perhaps sometimes able to do tremendous evil. Well, this tenuous relationship, of course, between the Christians and the Roman government went on for quite a few years until the 4th century when Emperor Constantine came along. On the eve of a battle, he had a big dream. And in that dream, Jesus spoke to him, and he saw crosses. And so he painted crosses on the shields of his soldiers who went out the next day into battle and won the fight. And immediately, Constantine declared that the church, Christianity, would be the official religion of the Roman Empire. And literally overnight, we as Christians went from being illegal to be Christians to being illegal not to be Christians. Forced into Christianity by the point of the sword and taking over all of Western culture. A privileged position that we have enjoyed now for well, nearly 1,600 years. Overnight, everything changing for the church. But of course, things about the church and Christianity didn't stay a matter of life and death forever. No, it sort of took a more subtle role. Being a Christian, being a part of a church was still important. In fact, belonging to the right church might mean that you would get a promotion at work, or not. Being a member of the right church might mean that you were a member of the right social circle, or not. In fact, being a part of the right church may mean you got elected as president of the United States, or not. And today things are really confusing sometimes about our relationship with government, how we negotiate this relationship between God and Caesar. Because after all, in this country, from a very founding, we've tried to do away with Caesar, to not have any Caesars to bow to. So we created a democracy. We created a free market economy. We created freedom of religion and separation of church and state. And we thought we had the problem solved. And yet, as Methodist preacher Will Willimon suggests, quote, a free market economy has many ways of enslaving, all in the name of freedom. In a democracy, there is no Caesar, no emperor, which merely means that here, we, the people, get to be our own tyrants. And thank goodness we have had, throughout the history of our country, Christians of good conscience who are willing to stand up to governments and society at large. From the abolition of slavery to women earning the right to vote, to the end of child labor, to the civil rights movement. As writer Brian McLaren has noted, we have had no movement for positive social change in this country without the participation, without the leadership of our churches and Christians of good conscience. Whenever we have made a step forward as a nation, it's because Christians of the church have been a part of it. And yet we recognize we live in a country that affords us that possibility. Why, we won't even lose our tax-exempt status with the IRS if we take a stand on a political position. Now, we can't endorse a political candidate, and quite frankly, I think that would be a dangerous road to go down, but we can stand up. We can say things. We do live in this country. So it's confusing, isn't it? We debate this relationship between church and state. And even now, the government has seemed to have wanted to draw a clearer and clearer line separating itself from the church. And yet, on the other hand, many of our elected officials seem too eager to pose in front of TV cameras with them wrapped in the flag and saying a prayer. They want us to know just how pious they really are. And there really isn't any agreement among Christians about the government. In fact, it's been a long practice among many Christians not to participate in the armed forces or even to pay taxes that would go to national defense. After all, they remind us, God said, "Thou shalt not kill." Other Christians see it as their religious duty to make their voice heard in government, to influence it as best as they can, some on the left, some on the right. Some Christians fight hard to keep the line drawn between church and state. Some Christians complain that there can't be prayer in public schools, and yet other Christians of good conscience have fought to keep that separation in place. So what are we to do? What are we to make of all this? Well, I think it's hard to say. It's hard to say, except maybe to go back to what Jesus said. To hear Jesus' answer, to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Maybe like the crowd around Jesus that day, we also will not get an easy yes or no answer. Maybe we'll be left to struggle with it day in and day out, and how we live our lives and how we voice our conscience. So we will continue to. We'll continue to pay taxes, and some of us not to pay taxes, to support the government and also to object to the government, to go to war and also to protest against those wars, knowing knowing that none of these things are an end unto themselves. But like the psalmist said, everything belongs to God. And you and I bear his image. So whose are you? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.